Hey folks, thanks for joining. So today I'm going to be talking about extending rational models of communication from beliefs to actions. And this is joint work with my colleagues Robert, Mark, and Tom. All of us are at Princeton. So models of communication typically fall into one of two broad categories. The first, beginning with Grice in 1975 and more recently with the Rational Speech Act, focus on communication to influence beliefs. These models typically take informativeness as a basic objective, with speakers choosing utterances to reduce the listener's uncertainty about the state of the world. Another thread of research from game theoretic pragmatics, as well as instruction following in robotics, emphasizes communication to induce actions in the listener. These models typically take an utterance and map it into some sequence of actions in the world. To compare these two perspectives, we can imagine our friend Bob, who's waiting to cross the road. Now let's say Bob gets impatient and decides to step out before the light changes. Unbeknownst to Bob, there's a car barreling towards him. Now, naturally, we want Bob to cross safely. But unfortunately for him, a belief-oriented model might choose to inform him about the presence of a cloud up in the sky. This does in fact reduce Bob's uncertainty about the state of the world, but it doesn't necessarily help him. So we can introduce the idea of relevance, or a question under discussion, to focus discourse on some particular aspect of the world, such as the state of the road, and produce an utterance like "there's a car over there." Intuitively though, we'd like a way to derive relevance from first principles. Information that will help Bob is information that will affect his actions. This is very natural for action-oriented models, which might produce an utterance or an imperative such as "wait for that car." However, these models are somewhat unsatisfying as a general model for human communication because we clearly use communication to do more than just induce immediate actions. We communicate about abstract concepts, beliefs. So we're left in a position where the RSA-based models offer principled mechanisms for explaining how communication should affect beliefs, but don't necessarily have a great way of deriving relevance, that is, of how utterances map into outcomes. On the other hand, action-oriented models tend to treat the listener as a sort of puppet. They have a clear grounding in outcomes in the form of listener actions, but the focus on concrete actions makes it difficult to account for abstract beliefs. So one of our contributions here is to propose a combined model, which understands both how utterances affect beliefs and then how those beliefs give rise to actions. It can thus intervene on beliefs in order to induce actions. So going back to Bob, such a model might be able to suggest more general abstract strategies which aren't tied to this particular setting, such as looking both ways before crossing the street or not jaywalking. And the hope is that this dynamic of intervening on beliefs to affect actions would naturally lead not just to utterances that help Bob immediately, but also generalize to other contexts, such as the next road that Bob might encounter in the world. And that this type of language could help explain the use of generics and moral norms, which are ubiquitous in human societies. So today we're going to focus on two questions. First, is the fundamental goal of communication to update beliefs, induce actions, or some combination of the two? And second, could such combined models help explain relevance and generics in human language? Unfortunately, existing paradigms tend to focus on beliefs or actions and thus make it difficult to compare the two. So the first thing that we'll do is introduce a new communication game, signaling bandits. This allows us to define formal speaker models embodying each of these perspectives, and then compare them using a series of simulations, demonstrating the emergence of relevance and generics in these more complex decision settings. So in order to define signaling bandits, I'm first going to talk briefly about Lewis signaling games. In Lewis signaling games, a listener agent receives an utterance from a speaker and then chooses an action from some context A. This formalizes the idea of a coordination problem which underlies communication. But unfortunately, because there's a single correct action and zero payoffs otherwise, the world state is synonymous with the correct action. And thus, beliefs are synonymous with actions. And there's no such thing as partial knowledge. For a more complex decision setting, we turn to multi-armed bandits. In multi-armed bandits, an agent makes a choice from a series of actions, but these actions have more complex payoffs, either probabilistic or scalar values. However, multi-armed bandits is a single player game where an agent learns this partial knowledge via repeated interaction with the environment. So our first contribution is to combine these two into a new game, signaling bandits, which has the more complex payoff structure of multi-armed bandits, but the communication paradigm of signaling games. So formally, a learner agent chooses an action from some context A, but unlike Lewis games, the payoffs are actually determined by an abstract world state, which defines a set of feature to value mappings. So here, for example, the green feature is always worth 2 points, the red feature is always worth 0, and the blue feature is always worth -2. So our full world state consists of both shapes and colors, and the knowledge of any individual feature constitutes partial knowledge about the value of any individual action. These features combine linearly, so a green circle is always worth 3, a red circle is always worth 1, a blue circle is always worth -1, and so on and so forth. One of the advantages of this paradigm is that it becomes very natural to construct multiple contexts from the same world, which allows us, as we'll see later, to evaluate generalization. So formally, actions are described by features phi. Rewards are then linear over the features, and we define a set of 84 3-action contexts drawn from the set of all 9 possible actions. So next, I'll walk through one round of gameplay. So our learner agent, as I said earlier, is faced with some action context A, and they have some beliefs about the value of each individual feature. These beliefs in turn determine their beliefs about the value of any individual action. And so they naturally have some beliefs about the specific actions that they face in this context. They then choose an action or develop a policy pi with respect to those beliefs. Again, formally, the listener actually marginalizes over all possible worlds to estimate rewards, and then we model them as a noisy rational agent with respect to those beliefs. Now, fortunately for the listener, they also have a speaker agent who produces utterances that supply partial information to guide the learner's decision-making. These utterances are things like, the circle feature is worth 1 point. Formally, permissible utterances are any feature value combination. So green 2, red 2, green 1, green -2, and so on and so forth. Now, when the speaker produces an utterance, this naturally causes the listener to update their belief state about the world, which in turn affects their beliefs about the available actions, and thus their action policy. So as we can see, this affords a diverse set of communication strategies. In addition to the straightforward message shown here, the speaker could, for example, exaggerate the value of the circle feature, sending a false message, which nonetheless makes it more probable that the listener will choose the best available action. They could also send a negative message, essentially warning the learner away from the very negative blue option. And finally, we can see that relevance becomes a very natural concept. The speaker could communicate about the value of the green feature, but that won't actually affect the learner's actions at all because the green feature is not present in this context. So formally, we then evaluate these outcomes by looking at the probability of the learner selecting the best action in the context, as well as their expected rewards given their distribution over actions defined by their policy. We can also then evaluate generalization by taking the learner's belief state and evaluating their performance on all 84 contexts in this world, not just the immediate context. And this is where we can start to see the negative effects of such exaggerations, which could cause the learner to perform better in some specific contexts, but then hurt them in others. Great. So the key aspects of signaling bandits are that the world state is decoupled from the correct action, which allows for partial knowledge, as well as principled links between beliefs and actions. Second, we can construct multiple action contexts from the same world, which makes it easy to define notions such as relevance and generalization. It also allows us to define formal speaker models. So all of our speaker models follow the basic RSA framework, where a speaker chooses utterances to maximize some utility. Our first speaker, the belief speaker, chooses utterances that maximize the probability of the listener inferring the true state of the world. Our action-oriented speaker chooses utterances that maximize the probability of the listener choosing the single best action available in the context. And then finally, our combined speaker chooses utterances that maximize the expected utility of the listener's subsequent action. So we can then use signaling bandits to compare how these speaker models diverge. Our first simulation shows that signaling bandits generalizes Lewis signaling games. So we construct a small world consisting of 2 shapes and 2 colors in a single action context with the same payoff structure as a Lewis signaling game. We further restrict utterances to positive messages only. Under these circumstances, we show that speaker models all behave identically. That is, it's not possible to separate the 3 objectives. All 3 choose one of the 2 true messages. There's no incentives to do anything otherwise. Our second simulation uses the full signaling bandits setup I described earlier. So for each of the 84 action contexts, we have the speaker and the listener play the game, and then we show the average results over all 84 contexts. Look at the qualitative speaker strategies that emerge. We can evaluate speaker strategies as distributions over utterances. As described earlier, these are every possible feature value combination. So we can plot that here with the features on the X and the values on the Y, and then use a heat map to show the resulting distribution over utterances. Now, these features are ordered in descending value from left. So the high magnitude features, the positive features, green and circle, are on the left, and then the negative features, square and blue, are on the right. And so any messages on the diagonal are true, and any messages off the diagonal are false. So we can then look at the distribution induced by the three objectives. So on the left, we can see that the belief-oriented speaker essentially produces true utterances at random. In contrast, the action and combined speakers introduce a notion of context-grounded relevance. That is, they choose to communicate selectively about high magnitude, decision-relevant features, here primarily green on the far left and blue on the far right. However, we also notice that there's a significant probability mass off the diagonal. That is, they tend to exaggerate or lie about the value of a feature. So we can look at this quantitatively by looking at the fraction of messages that are actually truthful. And we see that in fact, action and combined message speakers send false messages nearly 70% of the time. However, they do this in service of their objectives and thus succeed at them. So the action speaker manages to obtain the best action 77% of the time, and the combined speaker manages to obtain by far the highest expected utility, more than double that of the belief-oriented speaker in the local context. However, again, we see the negative effects of this belief distortion when we start to look at expected generalization, where we see that the belief-oriented speaker actually generalizes the best, and the action and combined speakers suffer a significant drop in performance below that of the belief speaker on generalization. So overall, what we see is that belief speakers tend to be truthful but irrelevant for any given action context, whereas action and combined speakers send messages that are relevant for the local context, but can be false. This leads them to succeed locally, but generalize poorly. So our next question was whether expanding speaker context could incentivize truthfulness. And intuitively, in human communication, the speaker often faces uncertainty about the listener's exact decision setting. Thus, they can't exaggerate features in order to obtain a particular outcome because they don't necessarily know the exact decision structure the learner will face. So the way that we set this up in our game is by constructing a single global action context consisting of all 9 actions and allowing speakers to choose utterances with respect to that 9 action set. We then evaluate generalization as before on all 84 3-action contexts. And what we immediately see is that action and combined speakers become more truthful. And as a result, they now generalize much more effectively, better in fact than the belief-oriented speaker. So overall, what we've seen is that we've introduced signaling bandits. We've used that paradigm to formalize different speaker strategies and explored how this complex decision setting enables emergence of relevance, exaggeration, and generalization. Our next steps are collecting behavioral data to validate whether or not humans actually conform to these models, introducing the idea of pragmatic listeners in this context, and finally extending gameplay to iterated games, as well as the idea of social versus individual learning. So thank you very much for your time. Please feel free to drop me a line. And thanks again to my awesome collaborators, Robert, Mark, and Tom. Cheers.